Chapter 23. A steady drop will carve the stone. German proverb. As slow as it was to dig out the rock in the tunnel, at least we had been making progress there. The next few days were spent almost entirely in the garden, working hard for no other purpose than as a cover for what we were actually doing, or should have been doing. I didn't mind the idea of gardening, but the weeds were thick and sometimes thorny, and by the third day, it was hard to care about the dirt out here when I really wanted to be down in the tunnel working. After an entire afternoon of pointless sweaty labor, I didn't think the weeds looked any better than when we first began. When the heat of the day hit us, Fritz and I decided to sneak inside the building to get back to our real work. As before, he went into the tunnel while I removed dirt with the bucket. But the small basement room was already piling high with dirt, and that bothered me. We had a long way to go before we reached the west. What if we ran out of places to store the dirt? Something needed to be done with it. I briefly toyed with the idea of returning to the weeding. At least the weeds didn't require me to think so much. Then I smiled as a wonderful idea came to my mind. If it worked, it would solve both my problems. Rather than dump out the bucket inside the basement, I opened the boarded window and dumped it there. It made a much smaller pile than I expected, so I refilled the bucket from the dirt already in the basement and dumped it outside too. After 5 or 6 loads of dirt, I climbed outside and then used the small hand rake from the state to spread the dirt around. It went down smooth and dark and covered up every single weed beneath it. I didn't need to pull weeds, I could cover them up. Sure, our vegetable seeds wouldn't grow very well once they hit the hard ground a few centimeters down. But I didn't care about that. I didn't plan to be here that long. With renewed energy, I began emptying dirt from the basement. The routine was the same, to dump several loads at once and then spread it out. I did it slowly and tried to make it look as if I was pulling weeds rather than covering them. The watchtower was far enough away that unless the guards looked carefully, there wouldn't be any reason to investigate further, or at least I hoped not. I was always listening for the approaching sounds of one of their vehicles. After a while, Fritz called up to ask what I was doing, and when I invited him up to see it for himself, he only chuckled and brushed his hand across my head. I trust you to do so much hard work to get out of other work, he said. But don't go so fast. If someone is looking for progress, they'll never believe we got all that weeded in a day. He was right, and I returned to carrying dirt back up the ladder over and over. That was my routine. Climb down to the air raid shelter, scoop dirt into the bucket, hook it over my arm, climb up the ladder, dump it out. Repeat, again and again and again. Rest a little, and then start all over. I'd lost track days ago of how many times I made the climb. I could do this now in my sleep. Who knows? I was so tired, maybe I did. I usually took my rest in the shelter while I watched Fritz's progress. He was nearly 5 meters into the tunnel and kept track of how straight it was with some boards he had nailed together perpendicular to each other. If one end was always kept straight with the shelter's entrance, the other end should point like an arrow in the direction he should dig. One late afternoon, Fritz said he would lift the buckets for me if I would go and find water to refill his canteen. It required a short walk back to the main part of the city, but I was eager for the change of routine. I stripped off my overalls and stopped by the pond to wash my face and hands. If I was going to convince a restaurant to give me water, I needed to be presentable enough to walk inside. Then I set off toward a nearby sausage shop where my family used to eat. When I was almost to the restaurant, I roamed across the street to a building that had been bombed during the war and still hadn't been repaired. Attempts had been made to clear it some years ago. I could tell that because of some rusty old machinery and other pieces of equipment left on the site. There was even a long rope with a pulley attached so that the heavier items could be lifted onto trucks. A pulley! My mind began racing as I pictured that very item in the basement of the Welcome Building. With a pulley, there would be no more climbing up and down the ladder. Fritz could fill the dirt below, and I could pull it up with a rope and then empty it into the basement. We could work twice as fast with half the effort. I needed that pulley. Gerda, what are you doing here? I swerved around and saw that Anna had come up behind me. Her mother was already seated inside the restaurant where I intended to get water, though I hadn't noticed either of them before now. It shouldn't have surprised me to see them here. This was their neighborhood after all. but of course she would be surprised to see me and looking as dirty as I'm sure I did. I stepped back and forced a smile to my face. Fritz and I are gardening, like I told you about earlier. I just came to refill our canteens. Let me get it for you, she said, and then wrinkled up her nose. No offense, but you smell like you're up to your eyeballs in gardening. That was true enough in a way. I handed her our canteens and she took them inside while I waited, trying as hard as I could not to look at the pulley on the other side of the street. It was only attached by another thick rope. With a good knife, I could cut it free, but what then? Certainly not on a busy day as this one. The problem was that in this neighborhood, every day was busy. It was only at night after curfew when everything was quiet. After a few minutes, Anna emerged with full canteens of water so cold I could feel it through the metal. I wanted to gulp down an entire one right then. Thank you, I said rather awkwardly. She called out "You're welcome" as I walked away, which thoroughly confused me. We were friends again? Why? Nothing had changed. Unless it had changed on her end. Maybe the Stasi had decided to leave her family alone and she felt safe to be friends with me again. I didn't know if I was ready for that. After all, she had treated me horribly over the last couple of months, and I had much bigger things on my mind than anyone's friendship, which included a need to get into her apartment, I reminded myself. For the sake of the tunnel, I would have to make things good between us and soon. But in the meantime, I had a pulley to steal.